So, my name is Sadie Dingfelder, and I wrote this book, Do I Know You? A Face-Blind Reporter's Journey into the Science of Sight, Memory, and Imagination. It's a long title, right? And instead of reading from the book, I just thought I'd tell you about it. So, basically, I had a very nerdy midlife crisis where at the age of 40, I discovered that a lot of assumptions that I had made about myself and about other people were really wrong. And I had to revise my entire life story. And what sort of kicked off this midlife crisis is I was grocery shopping with my husband, Steve. And Steve is like a very easy guy to pick out of a crowd, generally, because he's 6'4". And but I lost track of him in this crowded grocery store. And when I found him again, he had gone totally rogue. He was just pulling, just all this snack food and other stuff we don't usually buy and just like tossing into our shopping cart. And I plucked a jar of Safeway Select brand peanut butter out of our cart. And I said, "Since when do you buy generic?" And Steve looked back at me with this look of total horror and fear. And that's when I realized this was not Steve, but just sort of like a guy who kind of looked like Steve. And I was so embarrassed. And I dropped the peanut butter back in the cart and I ran off. And I'm not generally that reflective of a person. And so I immediately was like, the way I interpreted that story first was like, haha, I'm hilarious. I can't wait to tell people that I did that. But then I was like, wow, this is not actually the kind of mistake anyone makes. Like, I don't know anyone else who would mistake a stranger for their husband/partner of many years. So I think probably like some people would have called their doctor at this point, but I'm a science writer. I was at the Washington Post as an entertainment reporter at the time, but before that, I spent 10 years as a science writer at the American Psychological Association. I had access to all the databases that I shouldn't have still had access to. So I logged into their research databases and started doing research. And pretty quickly, I came across face blindness, this concept of face blindness. I learned that humans have a near photographic memory for faces and not for other types of objects, right? Like if you're mugged by someone, you can probably pick that person out of a lineup even weeks later, right? But if a squirrel mugged you, like you would have no idea, right? Like all squirrels look the same. So that's sort of a little bit like how human faces look to me. I have a fusiform face area, but what I found out is mine is a little bit too thick. And it suggests that maybe it did not get what's known as the neural pruning, the tuning it needed when I was a little kid. So the way I found all this out is after I've read all this pile of studies, I started emailing researchers and asking them questions that I hope sounded like hypothetical. And eventually I got myself into a study. And it actually is pretty easy to get yourself into studies if you think you might be face blind, because people who study visual object identification love face blind people, because you have an entire chunk of your brain called the fusiform face area. You have two of them. They're each above your ears. They're about the size of like an almond, and they're devoted to face processing, which is so specific. So not long ago, researchers did single neuron recordings of monkey fusiform face areas, and they found that it only takes 200 neurons to encode a face. I learned that I'm in the bottom 2% of people when it comes to face recognition. And they used to think that prosopagnosia was something that only happened when you got brain damage, when you got shot in the head. Specifically, the first two cases were from World War II, where two Nazi soldiers got brain damage, where their fusiform face area were injured and they couldn't recognize even themselves in photos anymore. But in the 90s, a bunch of people who were face blind found each other on the nascent internet. It turns out that people with rare disorders are the power users of the internet. And lots of different groups of people were finding each other. And psychologists then found these people and started studying them. And what arose was the concept of developmental prosopagnosia. People who are face blind for no clear reason. Like, you know, we didn't get hit in the head or anything. So I'm in the bottom 2% of people who are in terms of face recognition, and that puts me on par with people who have sustained actual brain damage. And learning this about myself was a huge shock, because I spent my entire life assuming that I was neurotypical, and therefore my experience was roughly the same as everyone else's. But I was soon to learn that there are a lot of ways that my conscious lived experience and inner life are really, really different from the norm. And more importantly, scientists, there's sort of a revolution going on in neuroscience and psychology right now, where scientists are beginning to study subjective experience objectively for the first time in more than 100 years. And they're finding that there's way more variety in the human conscious experience than anyone ever thought was possible. So even if you are entirely neurotypical, if you assume that your conscious experience and perceptions are the same as your kid or your wife, you're probably wrong, right? And so anyway, I'm going to pass this off to Carl Zimmer in a second, even though I didn't give you any warning. And so, like, when I was in middle school, I was super lonely. And in retrospect, at the time, and in retrospect, up until I found out I was face blind, I thought that it was just because I was weird and kids are mean, right? Mm-hmm. That's definitely true too. But it's also true that people were trying to be friends with me, and I was not able to be friends with them in a consistent way because I couldn't recognize people from moment to moment. And so this invisible force had shaped my entire life in ways that I'm still like kind of reckoning with. Anyway, so my story comes out and I start getting emails from all sorts of people, and one of the people was my brother, who emails me and sends me an article from Carl Zimmer. And it's about, okay, so everyone has your little bookmarks, right? Okay. I would just want to do a little experiment where you all close your eyes and imagine an apple. Okay. Now open your eyes and tell me, okay, hands up for the people who the apple is as bright and realistic as if you, almost as realistic as if it was actually in front of you. Anyone? My friend Eric, who knew? Our friend journalist up here, what's your name? Brian. Cool. Okay, so you guys are what's known as hyperphantasia. And first of all, and you guys this is all very nascent research, and this is a weak effect. But overall, you guys tend to head towards arts kind of based careers, and you tend to have a good memory for your own life. So like big emotional moments from your own life, you can revisit usually in some detail. Okay, is there anyone who had nothing when they closed their eyes, like nothing at all? No one? Okay, it's just me. How about anyone who had something kind of shaky? Shaky. Okay, cool. So you're on the side of aphantasia, which is the inability to visualize. And so I had no idea that people could visualize, right? This is entirely new to me, and I kind of hardly believe it still. And people who can visualize will say to me, Sadie, you're crazy. Like, we're all talking about the same thing. You just don't realize that you're visualizing. I have an answer to that, and it isn't a poster. So for my book, I ended up crisscrossing the country. I went to a ton of neuroscience labs. I ended up spending 30 hours in MRIs, including in fMRIs, which is functional magnetic resonance imaging, which basically just tracks blood flow in your brain to see what parts of your brain are active when you try to do different sorts of things. So here I am with a matched control. I'm over here, and there's the control. And if you ask the matched control to imagine faces or places, the correct parts of her brain light up almost as if she's actually seeing it. So her fusiform face area is lit up over here. Her occipital place area is lit up over here. And that's when she's literally just imagining faces or places. My brain is not doing anything. Another thing that people have found that's really interesting is that visualizing actually looks a lot like seeing in your brain. The same parts of your visual areas light up, but also it goes in the opposite direction. So when you see something, when you actually see something, information travels from your eyeballs to your occipital cortex in the back of your brain, and then it sort of inches its way forward back towards your frontal lobe. Whereas if you are imagining something, you start out with your frontal lobe being like, let's think about apples. And then your temporal and other, your middle visual areas light up, and then your occipital area, your basic vision areas light up. So it goes in the opposite direction. Kind of cool. Okay, sorry, I lose my breath because I talk too fast. But I get this article from Carl Zimmer that explains this whole thing, and I think that was in 2019. But we're going to back up to 2010, and I'm going to pass it to you, where you read Adam Ziemann's case study, I think.
Right. So I'm interested in all this not through personal, my personal condition. Just I was actually I think at the time I was writing a regular column about the brain, and so I would just be sort of scanning around the journals and just finding interesting things about how the brain works, and so it was I came across a case study, and it was so interesting because there was this neurologist who was writing about a patient, maybe like 60 years old or something, and he woke up one morning, and he basically described it as that he had lost his mind's eye. He was blind in his mind. He was fine before. He woke up one day and he's like, I can't picture things anymore. And for him, it was kind of disturbing. So he went to, he wanted to go and see somebody about it. And so they were like, oh, this is strange because we haven't really seen this thing. This isn't really something that is part of the literature. What is this? And so they actually, like, this guy, they refer to him as MX, and this was in Scotland. He, they interview him, they ask him about things and about what he's gone through, and then they like have him do some, cognitive tests. Like, you're like, okay, well, how many windows are in your house? And he can like just tell them, like 8 windows or whatever. And he's doing all these, or they're having him like, think about a shape and then turn the shape around and talk about what's on the other side. And so what's weird is he cannot see, but he can do all these things that you would think you need to see with your mind's eye. Like, he can do visual processing in his head, but he can't see it. And so they just said, like, wow, this is interesting. We're just putting this out there. One person. And so I'm just writing my column and like, oh, like, this is an interesting case. And I was more interested in, like, what does this tell us about how, to me, what this really seemed like was like this person probably like had some sort of like mini stroke, something like that took out a part of his brain, and then that part didn't work anymore, which kind of tells us how it works in the rest of us. In other words, like, I just assumed, because I kind of have a mind's eye, that, well, this is just normal. So I would just talk about, well, how do we get imagery in our brain? That was it. So I published that, all very well, and then I started getting emails, and people were like, what? What are you talking about? And I'm like, what do you mean? And they're like, are you telling me that when you close your eyes, you see things? And I'm like, yeah. And then you're like, wait, I thought that this was just like people were just using a metaphor. And I'm like, I'm going to put you in touch with this neurologist. Because like, he's really curious about this, and I can't help you any more than just connecting you. And then I get another email. I'd be, and Adam Ziemann, the neurologist, I just be like, Adam, I got another one. And he'd be like, yeah. I'm like, all these people, I don't understand. And they're like, well, God bless. And so then he got all these people and started like doing questionnaires on them and so on. And he was like, I think this is a thing. And eventually he named it aphantasia. Then I moved over to the Times, and you know, he published another paper on those results. And so I said to my editor, like, hey, like, I kind of been following this guy, read it again. I'm like, yeah, sure. And the Times is a big audience. And so like I write about it again, and then boom, like all of a sudden, like people, like a lot more emails. And I'm just like, Adam, guess what? Just here you go. And now I'm like, just sweeping them in his direction. And then he just kept publishing more. And he's, you know, they're off to the races now. But yeah, so it was really cool to be sort of there, kind of watching something begin. This aphantasia, which, you know, like, I don't know what the percentages are, like 2% of people maybe?
Yeah, it sounds like it.
Yeah, so you're talking about hundreds of millions of people, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people on Earth, like, have this, and they're fine, you know, like, they go about their life, and, you know, it's another, like, just way of having a brain. And, yeah, so it's been, so I've sort of, like, said, like, okay, every 3 or 4 years, I will allow myself to go back and write about what's happening next in aphantasia world. And hyperphantasia is part of that now, because like there are some people at the other end who, like, you hear about, I mean, they can watch a movie in their mind, and it's as bright as a movie screen. It's incredible. So yeah, it's been pretty amazing, just as some of the very ordinary mind's eye.
Yeah, and actually, so again, like, most people didn't realize there was this wide amount of variation in human visual imagination. And I assumed everyone was like me. And it turns out that one of my best friends, Miriam, is on the hyperphantasia side. And she, I've always thought, was kind of a drama queen because she cannot get over breakups. Like, it takes her forever. And I, on the other hand, can get over years-long relationships in a matter of weeks. It's a little shocking. And so once I learned this about her, and I understood that, like, you know, she can't just hide her ex's pictures like me. Like, I hide an ex's picture and I forget that he ever existed pretty fast. But Miriam has these guys living in her mind forever. And she can, like, dress them up like paper dolls and, like, put them in new scenarios. And, like, I wouldn't leave the house. So it's pretty amazing, like, how different people can be. And I think that it's really cool that scientists are taking this sort of question of what is it like to be another person seriously again after dropping it for a long time, because the general thought was that it's impossible to study, and also we want to be real scientists, and real scientists study observable things, but thanks to fMRI you can observe some things happening in the brain. And then there's also really clever things you can do with non-conscious reflexes. So if you give people, this is work out of Australia, someone named Joel Pearson, and he does cool stuff like he will do galvanic skin response, which is just like how sweaty and anxious you get. It's like the same thing as a lie detector, basically. And if you have regular people read a scary passage about a shark attack, they get a little, they schwitz a little bit, right? If you give it to, you know, aphants, we stay cool and dry as a cucumber. We are not, it's just words on a page for us. Which also, yeah, and then another thing they discovered is that people's pupils dilate they constrict to imaginary bright light. But that only visualizers. Non-visualizers, our pupils just stay normal. Yeah. It's so cool. So there's a lot of, to me, there's accruing evidence that this is a real difference and not just like a problem with language or description or metacognition. Yeah. So does anyone have any questions?
Have you, so you started into all this through discovering your face blind.
Yeah. And
then you discovered aphantasia. Do you think that, I mean, has anybody looked at whether those are often linked?
Yeah, there's definitely overlap. It's more than you would expect, but it's not a perfect overlap. I wanted to figure out why I was face blind, because for most people it's largely genetic. And what I discovered is that my brain is organized very differently than most people on like a fundamental level, which is I'm stereo blind. So is anyone else in here stereo blind? Okay, or you may not even know what it is. Okay, so put your finger in front of your face and like close one eye, and then I'll close the other eye, and then close that eye, and go back and forth like that. Okay, you know how your finger's jumping like a few inches every time? That my brain only processes information from one eye or the other eye. It doesn't combine my two visual streams into a single perception. And I didn't realize this wasn't true for everyone. I thought everyone's world jumps back and forth like that every so often. And and so stereo vision, that combination of your two streams of vision, happens at the very first step of vision. And so everything downstream is affected, including weird things that you wouldn't think would be affected by depth perception, basically, including color perception. So I have like a chromatic aberration. I one time got into a news-wide room argument where I thought that this vest someone was wearing, I might get this flipped, but I thought it was like orange. Everyone else was sure it was yellow. And I was like, you guys are all messing with me. And like eventually the yellows prevailed because it was 100%. It was everyone else. So my color vision is actually affected by the fact that my brain doesn't integrate my two fields of vision. And there's amazing, really cool research that shows that if people have my condition where one eye is very dominant over the other, or even more simple, if you have cataracts in your left eye, when you're an infant, your eye projects almost entirely to the contralateral hemisphere, to the opposite hemisphere. And remember how I said the right fusiform face area does the heavy lifting? People with right eye cataracts as babies, and not with left eye cataracts as babies, have lifelong face processing deficits. And I didn't have a cataract, but I did have a very strong, my right eye was very strongly dominating over my left eye. And I spent most of my time looking at my right eye. And so that may be part of the story for why my right fusiform face area is too thick and is not doing a very good job. So yeah, so that was like a whole nother thing I discovered. And my parents, by the way, like this to me just answered so many questions about my childhood. Mm-hmm. I can't catch a ball. I can't thread a needle. This is a good one. Okay, so people who are stereo blind like me often like sort of stub their toes a lot and kind of hit things all the time, and we don't care because it's like the fabric of our existence, right? And so when I'm getting like settled in bed, Steve calls it the tornado, where I'm just like flapping around, and sometimes he gets hit in the face. And I thought that Steve was such a whiny baby because I'm like, yeah, sometimes you get hit in the face. It's not a big deal. But now I understand that other people are able to judge where their body is in space a lot better than mine. And scientists have found all sorts of really interesting ways in which people who are stereo blind interact with the physical world and visual world differently. For instance, when we go to grab things, the aperture of our hand is it's smaller, and then when we hit the thing we're grabbing, we like really feel it up for like a microsecond. I mean, this is all slow motion and cameras to get the grip on it. Whereas people with normal vision get their hand exactly right and just grab it, no big deal. And also when we're walking, we take shorter steps and we look closer to our feet. We're not looking ahead as far. So it's really like, again, an invisible force, a way in which my brain is like quite measurably different than anyone else's. And it was completely hidden from me and from my parents, who really should have noticed that. But they just, were like, well, Sadie's a klutz,
And you didn't, with these various conditions, you really just were sure that you had kind of a standard brain. You like, did people, if someone like talked about, I'm sure someone must have sort of mentioned in passing about like something involving their mind's eye.
Yeah. Okay. So
do you think they were just making stuff up, or?
Yeah. Metaphors, right? Language is such a sneaky thing because we all kind of assume we know what other people are talking about. Mm-hmm. But so when people would say, if you're anxious, imagine the audience naked. Like, I am actually shocked that people can do this, and I'm alarmed by it, frankly. You're supposed to imagine that people could be naked in the future, just conceptually thinking about people being naked. And same with like counting sheep, jumping over a fence. And then also think before you speak. So this is like something I haven't talked about yet, but I have no internal monologue. And I thought in movies, when they would like sort of have a soundtrack of what someone's thought process was, I thought again it was a metaphorical or very artistic way of showing what a stream of consciousness might be, like if you could hear it. I didn't realize that some people actually hear their own thoughts in their own voice, and people like Miriam have layers of commentary tracks going at the same time, and it's completely shocking to me. And I just have no idea how she gets anything done, honestly.
I actually, it's funny you mentioned that, because I actually sort of kind of backed my way into this issue as well, totally unintentionally. Just a few months ago, I was writing an article talking about an MIT neuroscientist who studies language, and named Eva Fedorenko, and her big question is like, how does language work, and what is it for? And you know, there's sort of a classic idea, which is sometimes ascribed to Noam Chomsky, that language is for thinking. In other words, like we need language in order to form these thoughts, and so we are in a sense talking to ourselves. And you know, and she's done all these studies where it's like she's been able to identify this very clear-cut like language network in the brain using fMRI, and you know, we'll have people like do these sort of cognition tasks, these complicated thinking tasks, and it's not active at all. And she's like, I don't think you need language to think. And then, you know, but on the other hand, language has all these properties that very clearly looks like language is evolved for communication. It's for communication, not thinking. And I said, like, but wait a minute. Like, I mean, I'm hearing myself thinking. I'm always hearing myself thinking. Like, of course we think and we think with words, right? And she's like, well, you do. You know, my husband would be very amused to hear you talk like this, because he doesn't have an inner voice at all. And I'm like, what do you mean? And she's like, oh yeah, like we don't exactly know how many people don't have an inner voice, but a lot of people do not have an inner voice at all. And I was like, that's crazy. That can't be right. But of course, it was just my assuming that, you know, this is the standard brain.
Yeah.
Again. Mm-hmm. And yeah, so there's face blindness, then there's you know, the mind's eye, and then the mind's voice.
Yeah.
And these are all on spectrums.
Yeah. For me, the joy of writing is finding out what I think, and I'll be writing, and I will be like, wow, that's a great idea, Sadie. Like, who knew you were that smart? Like, you know, because I have really only the dimmest of ideas of what I'm thinking until it's on the paper in front of me, or I have to talk through ideas. But really, paper is the way to go, because I have a terrible memory, and so I can have great ideas, but they're just gone in an instant if I say it out loud.
Are there ways, I mean, you know, we often like use the language of deficits, but but you know, people with the mind's eye like do all sorts of things, including being artists. And so I'm just sort of curious, like if you see advantages to the way your brain works in particular ways.
Yeah, definitely. First of all, I would not trade my brain for people with those busy, like visualizing, talkative brains. That sounds exhausting. And I understand why meditation is really hard for a lot of people. It's not, for me, the part that's hard about meditation is not falling asleep. I have no trouble, just my mind's already quiet. But if you make me sit there for too long, I'm going to fall asleep. But, okay, so we haven't talked about this yet, but there's something that's related to aphantasia called severely deficient autobiographical memory. And it sounds like a terrible thing to have, but I think it is the greatest gift, because people like my friend Miriam remember their lives as discrete episodes that are highly detailed. And as a result, they have a lot of trouble finding the through lines. And for me, I can't remember any details ever, but I always get the big picture. And the way, as a reporter, I've always tried to deal with this is I take a lot of notes, I take a lot of pictures, I'll take videos, you know, like to get things like, oh, it was like a checkerboard zebra print, you know, rug, or, you know, these things that I know. In fact, at the top of every notebook, I have like write down sensory details because like those are not going to stick in my brain. But I could hang out with a scientist all day and understand like the big picture of what they're trying to do. And I think that's so helpful. And actually, I interviewed Craig Venter, he's like very famous scientist. He was like on the cover of Time, Man of the Year or something. In 2000, he led the Human Genome Project, like the one that was a sort of
the private one.
The private one.
As opposed to the public one.
Right. And he actually previously worked at NIMH and he was running it there, but then they weren't buying the like automation machines that he wanted them to buy. So he created his own company, bought the automation machines, and then NIH was like, oops, this is the right way to do it. And then they started buying. Anyway, you get it. And super brilliant scientist. And he says that it's his sort of aphantasia / SDAM that is the key to all of his success, because he didn't understand the nitty gritty necessarily, but he had technicians and like brilliant scientists he worked with, but he got the big picture and he could see that the way forward was definitely automation. It was not this painstaking, like precise cutting DNA and sequencing it, and that would take forever. So yeah. And also he had a really similar school trajectory to me, which is silly to say. Like, I do not think I'm as smart as Craig Venter, just like for the record. And we have a lot of other differences. But we both really, really struggled in early school where memorizing was key. Like, neither of us can spell. We couldn't memorize multiplication tables. And like, so information that's out of context for people who have SDAM / aphantasia just does not stick in our heads. Whereas his wife would read a book, you know, and she would have information that she didn't necessarily understand all that well, but she could actually remember where on the page it was. So she could recall that information without having it integrated into like a deep understanding of, you know, the topic. And so for me and for poor Craig Venter, like there's no shortcuts. We have to really understand something to remember it. But once we got out of the land of rote memorization and into where big picture understanding and concepts started being what they were testing for, we did great. So yeah, so if you have a kid who's like really struggling to memorize, like don't fret. Like maybe in the long run, like once they're past the geography quizzes that I still can't pass, like they'll be okay. They'll start shining in school.
I just have a comment. Like, this is super fascinating, and I do think, like, when you're talking about young children, having worked as a teacher, and just also thinking as somebody who's an athlete, like the number of times you're asked to visualize things, with the assumption being that everybody can do that in the same way, it's really remarkable. And then I guess I'm curious to know: are there competencies related to visualization? Like, so for example, especially in the world of sports, I think a lot of times we tell people to like imagine themselves, you know, doing something really well, and that has a relationship to actually eventually doing it well.
Yeah. I mean,
I don't know the science. It's more like I'm just recognizing sort of like the folk logic of this is that like that one that works, and that works for everyone, and how just unsettling it must be to have somebody continue to ask you to do something that just doesn't translate, you know?
It definitely bothers people to different degrees too.
Yeah.
Like my lifetime of people telling me to imagine being on a peaceful beach, like I just smooth that over. I'm like, well, obviously we're all just like sort of trying to humor this meditation teacher. You know, and other people do notice it, and it does bother them, especially they're like in therapy. I think like visualization comes up a lot, and a lot of people with aphantasia have complained that they feel misunderstood, and also people with SDAM. So people like me with SDAM, I mean, I have no childhood memories basically, but I was not like traumatized. I just don't remember. I also don't have any episodic memories from any point in my life, basically. And so a typical therapist would interpret that as being like, I'm highly traumatized, you know? But It's just the way my brain works. And it can cause people to get misdiagnosed too. So like if you have SDAM and you have PTSD, you're not going to have the intrusive visions or reliving of traumatic moments, but you might have like physiological responses or intrusive thoughts in some other way. And so anyway, but in answer to your question though, there's no one's really found this difference. Like that the original study was with this guy who was a surveyor, and he was passing all the tests that you would see, like rotating objects in space things. He was passing them just like a normal person would, except with one weird quirk, where he usually takes, if a neurotypical person who can visualize, if you ask them to rotate objects, the amount of time they take to rotate that object is actually like in proportion to how much you have to rotate it, right? But this guy who had acquired aphantasia probably from a small stroke was doing everything the exact same amount of time. So like maybe he hit a ceiling for that test and he was really good at it because I think he was a surveyor or something. Mm-hmm. But the bottom line is that there's not any clear group level differences between hypervisualizers and non-visualizers, except for the very small tendencies I pointed out before. I think within this big group of people who can't visualize, there's some people who are unconsciously visualizing. And I'm not in that group, right? I think my brother might be sort of in that group because he's really good at chess. Mm-hmm. I can't imagine, like, how do you do chess? Like, if you can't visualize at all. Anyway, so... And then there's me and the people like me who are going to be really bad at anything that would require unconscious or conscious object rotation, I assume. Mm-hmm. But this is just me guessing. I don't really know.
A quick question. So I write a lot about hereditary mental disorders,
cool.
Like mostly bipolar disorder, sometimes autism. And so what's really intriguing to me about what you're talking about is that I think like a certain faction of people, like going back to William James, like the varieties of religious experience. Maybe some people don't have read the book. It's like, it's a very exciting book because it's not really about religion. It's about what you're talking about. It's about individual variability.
Yeah.
Right. And so the complaint he's making and the complaint that Oliver Sacks is going to make later is like, we lump too broadly. We have a category called autism.
Oh, yeah.
And so the specific question I had, oh, and by the way, do you know his brother was schizophrenic? Like, right, so, the Huxley family, there's all these famous examples.
Yeah.
Psychotic illness running in a family alongside some sort of genius and so forth. And so what I'm wondering is there some correspondence between aphantasia, for example, or prosopagnosia and a disorder? So the first time I heard of aphantasia was my colleague whose twin sons both have autism.
Oh.
And he and his wife both think they're sort of somewhere on the spectrum. So I wonder if that's the question. And then the secondary question is, to what extent does this whole line of research relate to, what people sometimes call transdiagnostic factors?
Yeah.
You see what I mean? Looking for finer grained capacities that differentiate people with disorders, but also, across the individual population.
Yeah. Yeah, this is such a good question because, so I found some interesting transdiagnostic things. So, do we all know what the DSM is, the diagnostic? Okay. Do we all know that it was like totally made up? Like, okay.
Yeah.
A lot of people don't know this.
It wasn't updated that often. They're on the fifth edition in like how many decades?
There's a great book I read called The Book of Woe, which I found highly convincing, which basically makes the case that psychiatry in a panic just like sort of made up a bunch of half-baked like categories. And I like the fact that we're all talking about spectrums these days, right? But when we say the autism spectrum, we're really talking about a lot of different spectrums, right? Like you can almost imagine like what are those spider graphs, spider web graphs where people are going to fall all different places on all different spectrums. But what one line of research that I'm really obsessed with is they feed data into like artificial intelligence machine learning algorithms without a priori categories, and they ask the machines to find groups. And one of the fun things, one study that I loved was they had all these children and they had structural brain scans on these kids. So they had like how their brains were connecting up with white matter. And they also had their test scores on everything and their diagnosed learning disabilities. And the computer was like, this is me personifying the computer. The computer was like, these labels are garbage and they mean nothing. Except that the people with labels tended to have brains that were organized in more of a daisy chain network versus a hub and spoke. And so a hub and spoke network is like I think it's the most efficient, or it's a highly efficient way, which is what airlines use, where you have some hubs that are highly connected to like more sparsely connected areas, and you rarely have to make more than one hop to get somewhere. But your daisy chain networks are going to have some random highly efficient connections and then a lot of really inefficient connections. And I imagine my brain, I have an incredible memory for music. And so I imagine I have some sort of like hippocampus, music memory connection that's just like a one-way, like a real fast, tight, like a Acela train that actually works. But my visual area is just like requires like 17 different, connections, and your luggage is definitely going to get lost. And so, so transdiagnostically, like the particular ways in which your brains have these tight connections and these inefficient connections they're going to be all over the map, but you're going to find more quote unquote problems, or you're going to get what is sort of like a not neurotypical profile. So like with lots of peaks, like things I really am great at and things I really suck at. Or if like you imagine like the gifted, that famous like Far Side cartoon where the gifted kid's like pushing the door that says polar opposite. Like you have this, I think that one thing that neurodivergent people might have in common is this sort of uneven profile, strengths and weaknesses that might result from the sort of more of a daisy chain network. But even that is going to be a spectrum. And I don't expect there to be any bright lines, right? Like it's just going to be a nice normal curve. So yeah, our language categories are really leading us astray. And no one should say things like, oh, I'm an extrovert, I'm an introvert. No, you should say like, I'm in the X percentile for extroversion, introversion.
So is there no category of mental disorder where it's common to have aphantasia? I wonder what that's.
Not that I know of.
Yeah.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah, they haven't found any big group level differences.
I think it's kind of a separate thing. I mean, there are these sort of connections with, like with hyperphantasia.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it can be a little connected with like some of these emotional problems, not problems, but like it's hard to let some things go because they're always there, just right in your mind. So. But that's the only thing that I've come across, and I've asked people about it too. Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
Question. Yeah.
So, like, two related questions. So, it's about unconscious or subconscious experiences, particularly like dreaming, how that works, but also like hypnosis, and I think there's like therapeutic kind of questions about that. Like, have you ever undergone?
Do you dream?
Hypnosis. I'm also interested about psychedelics.
I have a whole story in my book about like when I tried acid in college. But okay, yeah. So in answer to your question, I and most people with aphantasia have beautiful, vivid visual dreams that we forget instantly upon waking up. And so I will wake up, I scuba dive, and I get to scuba dive in my dreams all the time. And I wake up and I'm like, Steve, it was so beautiful. And he's like, what? And I'm like, I don't know anymore. So, yeah. And then, yeah, so most people with aphantasia. And then another thing that most of us have in common is that we do hallucinate on psychedelics. Like, so the problem is voluntary imagery. Like, but involuntary imagery, no problem. We can't decide to see something. And then, let's see, was there a third question? It was dreaming. Hypnosis. Oh, okay. Well, what Phil Zimbardo tried to hypnotize me. He's like a very famous psychologist from the Stanford prison experiment. And he failed, and he's pretty good at it. So like, I don't think I can be hypnotized. And I also think that I'm in this may be a subcategory of people with aphantasia, but like, we live in like such a concrete world where there's like nothing magical going on. There's no auras. There's no like stars, signs like affecting our lives, And I think we just tend to be like, and anyway, in college, when I came across B.F. Skinner, I was like, this guy's got it down. Like, no, like mental processes don't matter. Who even knows what they're thinking? Like, and I trained my roommates and my then boyfriend and myself to do all sorts of things that I wanted us to do. And I was great at rat training. But I think that was my bias, right? Like I was taking my own experience and incorrectly assuming that it was similar to everyone else's. Mm-hmm. But Skinner was also an aphant, probably.
Oh, yeah. Okay, I have a great memory for melodies. Terrible memory for words, and I don't even really hear words in songs. So I didn't realize other people were deciphering the lyrics. I thought that everything was basically like Pearl Jam, where it's just like, but apparently a lot of singers do enunciate, and Steve can pick out whole phrases sometimes.
So one of the things I've always been really curious about is like the relationship between the different sensory modalities, like in your inner world. So I'd always kind of assumed like I've got very weak mental imagery, like I can't really imagine stuff very well. But I've got really, really vivid, like auditory, imagery seems weird to say.
Yeah.
But like I could hear a song like almost as vertically as if it were like playing on the radio.
Yeah.
Is there any like I always kind of naively assume like there's a trade-off there where it's like, oh, you've got a certain amount of like mental imagination resources that you kind of get distributed from the different senses. But it sounds like maybe that's not the case. And maybe there's some folks who just like nothing going on in any kind of sense to me.
Yeah.
But like in general, is there a sort of relationship between the different kinds of sense modalities?
It looks like, I think I've only seen like one little study on this, but it seems that there's a correlation, a high correlation. So if you have a real vivid visual imagination, you tend to have a really vivid oral imagination. And other senses, smells and touch. Some people can really summon up all of this. And it kind of makes sense to me, even though the input kind of comes from different directions. They all come together pretty early. And then in terms of replaying memories, your hippocampus is coordinating it all.